We're going to cover plants really quickly. This is going to be like the shortest plant presentation ever. If you're a plant person, I'm sorry. I apologize now. The important message here is plants are important, not only from an aesthetic point of view, but also for soil structure and health. This plant selection criteria, very basically, soil moisture conditions, sun exposure. Most of our guidelines, if you look in the back of the manuals, like Rain Garden Handbook and the LID Technical Guidance Manual, the plant selections are organized by moisture zones within the bioretention area. So that's one way we really kind of organize the organized plant selection. But there's also sun exposure, above and below ground infrastructure. That big bioretention area that we visited at the end is a great example of other considerations that you have to consider, like site distances. And that's critical there, right, in an intersection like that. Above and below ground infrastructure, site distances are all critical. Pedestrian use, adjacent plant communities, visual buffering, and aesthetics. Visual buffering and aesthetics, so this is where we can really use bioretention, I think, for a multi-purpose. The picture here is from High Point, where the sidewalk is farther away from us, the road close to us, and these bioretention areas are providing a great visual buffer between a residential collector road, fairly busy road, and the houses, as well as also separating the pedestrian from the vehicular traffic. So you can use these systems for dual purpose. Here's a look at the planting zones, but basically wet at the bottom, this transition zone as you go up sides, and then drier up top. Again, you'll see the plant list sort of organized all around this. Good news for us is we have a lot of native plants and hardy cultivars that are very common in this part of the world that work beautifully in bioretention area. If you think about it, we have plants that are adapted to wetter winters but really dry summers. Yeah, and so that's what you get in a bioretention area. This is just a screenshot of actually the back of the LID manual. I believe this is the LID manual, not the Rain Garden Handbook. A screenshot of the organization of those plants. So we have some good plant lists, both from this region, Portland, even up to Vancouver, BC, that could be applicable. But we have a lot of great plant lists here. Seattle, the LID manual, Seattle, the Rain Garden Handbook. There's a lot of resources around plant selection. Above ground, probably the most important aspect of plants is aesthetics. And aesthetics are critical. They're important. It's below ground where really the heavy lifting is going on as far as plants. And agricultural literature documents for decades as well documented the role of plants in building soil structure. We know that's the case. Very important for building soil structure. The penetration of those roots, promoting microbial activity, and that's all part of building that soil structure that's important for maintaining permeability. Very important from that aspect. City of Portland documents increasing infiltration rates in a 12-year-old commercial parking area from 8 inches an hour to 13 inches per hour. And we've documented that in other research projects. So at WSU, all of the different treatments we had at WSU, they all increased. The infiltration rates went up over time. Well, that's kind of unusual for an infiltration facility. That's usually the other way around. And that's likely, very likely, again, well, it's almost certainly likely due to the plants. Again, root penetration, building soil structure. Another benefit of plants is pollutant uptake, but not necessarily into the above ground plant structure. But again, promoting soil structure and soil microbial activity and the microbes taking up contaminants, metals and nutrients. Lucas and actually Greenway in Australia observed increased phosphate removal in vegetated versus non-vegetated bioretention systems. That shouldn't be any surprise at all. What was a surprise in that research is when they went through the whole mass balance, they found that phosphate removal was more than you could account for in the plant uptake. So there was rapid and significant uptake by the soil microbes. Interesting. So that was a very interesting finding from that study. What we don't know is how then that cycles through the system. In other words, those things are living, dying, and dying, and all that. So, how the ultimate end product of that we don't really know, but they did confirm the importance of the soil microbes for phosphate uptake. Okay, last slide on plants. Mulch regulates soil temperature, reduces weed establishment, adds organic material, so it's an important component. What's interesting is what mulch are you going to use? It's important as far as how that stuff's going to move around in the system. City of Seattle has been for years now using coarse compost in the bottom of their bioretention areas, and then the arborist chips like we saw in the Bellingham installations up on the sides. And what they found is that coarse compost locks together better. It doesn't float as easily and float into your infrastructure or out of the system. I kind of wonder about that. I don't know if that probably doesn't inhibit weed establishment as well. So there might be some more maintenance involved there. So what you choose for mulch is interesting. Generally what's recommended is arborist wood chips. I've always found those to be fairly easy to find, but I've talked to people who said, no, we just can't get them. Certainly that can be the case. But I always found it's pretty easy to find this stuff because there's constantly Asplund and others out there trimming trees, right? And roadside for utilities and sight distance and all that. And what you have to do is plug into those folks, those arborists that are chipping that stuff up all the time, and get on their list. Question is, problem with arborist chips floating? Yes, they will float. From what I could tell, the order of bad to better, the beauty bark, that fine beauty park stuff that people like the way it looks, is the worst as far as a mulch. It floats, just disappears, just goes off. It seems like the finer arborist chips maybe float pretty easily. The coarser stuff maybe locks together a little better. You saw some pictures from Kitsap where they had rock for the water entrance, and then generally where that water would flow towards the bottom of the bioretention area. It's kind of a rock pathway to reduce that floating. So you can do that type of design where you're creating a kind of a rock mulch flow path, and then maybe arborist chips off to the side of that. So there's different ways to design around it, and but there's going to be some movement of that material. As the plant's established and start to cover the area, there's going to be less and less movement of that mulch. So this is what's generally recommended: 2 to 3 inches thick, chipped or shredded softwood or hardwood arborist chips. There's other variations. City of Portland, you see a lot of rock mulch. That's certainly not going to replenish organic material. And it's not going to capture hydrocarbons and metals as well. So there's a trade-off there. But they use it quite regularly. So the question is, why is it so thin in the bioretention cell? It's hard to say. I mean, you can really see a difference from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and area to area as far as how densely these things are planted. Go to some of the older installations in Seattle, and they are really thick, almost impenetrable. So that was and since then they've backed down on the density, somewhat on their planting densities. I know you see a lot that are not planted, as nearly as dense. So I don't know if it's just it's the the plant person, the arborist, the people who are suggesting the plant palette, and it's just that particular preference. But there is a couple considerations related to that. So if the bioretention area is planted relatively densely and the plants kind of capture that area, you're going to have less problem with this mulch issue that we're talking about. That mulch is going to stay put, and less weeds establishing. On the other hand, if you have a facility where, say in an industrial setting, and so you are anticipating high pollutant inputs, it might be wise to have, because you would potentially want to replace that mulch more regularly because of the metal and hydrocarbon input, that's a great pre-filter and will preserve your media below that if you keep that mulch in good shape. So you might be wanting to change that mulch fairly regularly. And so a very dense plant palette, it'll be harder to do that, or dense plantings. So that's a consideration where you might be thinking about plant density as far as how I'm going to maintain this thing over time, given the inputs. and maybe a little bit sparser so that you can get that mulch in and out of there more easily. That's one consideration as far as plant density that, from maintenance perspective. So I think in most of the settings that we looked at today, and a lot of the settings for bioretention, that's not necessarily so much a consideration. The inputs are not that high.